Welcome everyone to the second season of the early Muslim expansion by Kings and Generals. We're going to be covering the Arab conquest of Iran and Egypt.
The early Muslim expansion changed the fate of the Middle East and the world. In our first season, we've covered the very early campaigns, mostly led by Khalid ibn al-Walid in Iraq and Syria. This second documentary will describe the Arab incursions into Anatolia, Egypt, Iran, and North Africa, showing how the Rashidun Caliphate became the dominant power in the wider region. These long videos are extremely time-consuming and difficult to make, so consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It is probably a good idea to start our video with the description of the early Muslim army. From Ajnadain in 634 to Alexandria in 641, Islamic armies of seemingly minuscule size picked apart the veteran armies of two separate massive empires in battle after battle. The question remains.
It really was impressive, and I know everyone's kind of pointed out that the Romans and the, Persians were incredibly weak, after surviving plagues and devastating wars with one another, that, they were very weak, and that the Muslims definitely arrived on, basically attacking the perfect time, right? And that's a huge part that played into them being able to take on both powers at the same time. But I still think it's really impressive, I know, definitely the Sassanids and the Romans were not at their best at all, but, I think it's still impressive, you know what I mean? I'm still amazed at how far they got,
How did these earliest Muslim soldiers fight, and how did they forge the caliphate with such speed? Akin to most other regions and centers of civilization within the ancient and medieval world, Arabia was a violent place in its own unique fashion. Far from being comparable to the large hegemonic empires which bordered and often puppeteered its many tribes to further their own agendas pre-conquest, the barren desert of the Arabian Peninsula and most of its people are more accurately balanced against the fearsome nomadic folk of the Great Eurasian Steppe. Fighting against rival tribes and defending one's own kin from attack was a central part of life, a fact which played a key role in creating the local culture. Motivated in part by vicious terrain that was untenable to larger military campaigns, the dominant tactic was the so-called razzia, a raiding expedition designed to plunder, pillage, and take slaves.
It's interesting he mentioned its similarity to the nomadic steppes, because it brings me back to when we covered the Genghis Khan series by, Extra History, and there is a lot of similarity, you know what I mean, in that, a lot of the combat seemed to be on horseback, obviously, just tribes all fighting one another, moving around, before consolidating the big armies in which it would eventually produce under the caliphate. But here it's just tribal warfare, and especially here, I've heard a lot that conquering Arabia was something empires had trouble doing, mainly due to just how hot it is and how much of it is just barren desert, at least in the past, you know what I mean? And so he mentioned that couldn't really move large armies in here, which makes a lot of sense. So their tactics here were to be incredibly quick, which explains their just great cavalry that they had and how fast and swift they were. I guess you get a lot of practice from here. So it's interesting. It just kind of reminded me of all that,
Such a wealth of common martial experience meant that most Bedouin Arabs were, especially compared to the agriculturalists and urban citizens of the Near East, a veteran military population.
Which would explain why they took a knack to fighting, because in Season 1, they're just really good fighters, the Muslims, you know what I mean? And now that kind of explains a lot why they are, because they are basically fighting, and I imagine living there in the Arabian Peninsula definitely was not an easy thing to do, especially with all this tribal warfare, so I guess everyone kind of had to learn how to fight. So that kind of explains why they took a knack to warfare so quickly. Like, they're basically already in it, you know? So, yeah.
This pre-Islam tribal society provided a solid foundation for the development of a conquest army. But until the Prophet's lifetime, and possibly afterwards as well, there was no army as such. With very few exceptions, every single adult male in Bedouin life was a warrior, compensated for their endeavors with booty, honor, or the defense of their own kin group from enemies who were attempting to do the same. With the advent of Islam, leadership of Muhammad, and the subsequent unification of the Arabian Peninsula under the first Rashidun Caliph, its weapon-rich cities and Bedouin-inhabited hinterland alike came under one rule and one religion. This warlike population, who until recently were occupied fighting one another in small-scale struggles, could now be directed en masse to attack the settled, exhausted, and unready empires beyond the desert frontier. Although now turned to a single purpose, to expand the Dar al-Islam, the early Islamic armies remained in many ways what they had been before, tribal raiders. As the assault on Byzantine and Sassanid territory began, it quickly became clear that the established empires were not going to be met on their own terms. It was to be a mobile war of razzia, which the two emperors and their armies, each bent towards attacking the other, simply could not match. To this purpose, a primary strategic weapon of war utilized by the conquering Arabs was the unassuming camel. Accustomed to traveling across incredibly arid terrain with essentially no water, these workhouse pack animals were used to lethal effect on campaign. Camel-mounted armies of Muslim infantry would frequently strike Byzantine or Sassanid territory from unexpected, undefended angles, bleeding the empires of manpower and money before fading back into the desert, where their enemies simply could not go. Imagine playing a game of Civilization and possessing an area of apparently impassable terrain near your key resource-producing regions, so you naturally do not fortify the area because you don't need to. After all, if no powerful enemy can get there, they can't attack it anyway. However, one of your underdog opponents then starts cheating and bypassing the impassable to strike at the heart of your most crucial land.
Oh,
Worse
wow.
still, you can't chase them back through that terrain. If you try, you give them the opportunity to strike elsewhere.
So basically, camels are hacks. The camels break the game. That's cool though. Like he didn't mention camels in season 1, mainly in how they used them as disguises to scare off horses. But it's cool seeing just how the camels in war, I guess the war camels, if you were. We've covered horses, we've covered elephants, and now we have war camels. And that's cool. I guess their main advantage is just being able to traverse areas that other animals can't. And I guess their longevity in terms of just going through barren wilderness. So, man, camels are OP. That's really cool.
This is what the established empires must have felt when the Muslims started attacking. Khalid ibn al-Walid, arguably the greatest early Muslim general, exploited this prodigious mobility to frustrate and exhaust a Sassanid imperial army in what is perhaps the greatest example of its use. During an attack in 633, Khalid planted his Arab army in front of Hufair and tempted Persian general Hormuz, then stationed at Kazima, to approach him. His heavily armoured force embarked on a tiring march to do so. When the commander got there, however, he discovered that the Muslims had ghosted into the desert and were beelining back towards Kazima. Bound to march in the defence of such a strategically vital place, Hormuz forced his unruly, exhausted troops on a countermarch. By the time Hormuz arrived back near the city, his army was near mutinous, barely in a fit state to move, let alone fight, and in a terrible situation. Meanwhile, Khalid's well-mounted, leisurely stroll back to Kazima had allowed his forces to prepare adequately. In the subsequent Battle of Chains,
Yeah, I mentioned this a lot in the season 1 reactions, but the Muslims have speed and maneuverability, which has been a huge part in why many great empires were born. You think of the Mongols and their horseback, mounted combat warfare ways, all over the place. I'm sorry. The point is, and then you think of like when we covered Alexander the Great, he had great speed compared to the Greek armies of the time. You think of Napoleon, who was renowned for his speed and maneuverability, which was a huge part of why he won so many battles. There's a trend, and the Muslims just have that. You know what I mean? Speed and maneuverability, huge factors in why we've seen so much success in warfare, and they just had that in spades compared to their slower counterparts in the Romans and the Persians,
Rejuvenated Muslim forces soundly thrashed Hormuz's thoroughly outmaneuvered, physically drained army. The average Arab warrior of the early Islamic conquest period would have been far less standardized in form than a soldier from the Byzantine or Sassanid empires. Infantry and cavalry were both prominent, despite Arabia's prominent lack of viable horse-rearing ground. Moreover, the distinction between foot and mounted troops was often blurred. Changing with the situation, cavalry might dismount and fight as infantry, while what might be dubbed mobile infantry were frequently carried to battle on horses or camels. Equipment, relatively similar between both cavalry and infantry, was purchased and provided by the individual warrior or tribesman, rather than being issued by the Rashidun Caliphate as a state. However, potential combatants who were indeed too poor to assemble equipment of their own might be assisted by wealthy kinsmen, neighbors, or other benefactors. Even for the well-to-do in Muslim society, however, good quality equipment was scarce in the early days. There was nothing overly unique about Muslim weaponry during the wars of expansion. Spear, sword, and bow were the primary methods of assault, but it is said that the Arabs possessed particularly long spears and remarkably short swords when compared to their enemies. As this short sword was carried in a shoulder baldric rather than a belt at the waist, it is likely that this style was copied or inspired by the old Roman gladius, which was kept in a similar manner. Metal armor seems to have struck both hot and cold in the Arab mindset from the very beginning, as is evident in a saying of the second Caliph Umar. He describes mail armor as keeping our horsemen busy, a nuisance for our infantry, and yet always a strong protection. Originating from the scalding hot and sun-bleached deserts of Arabia, heavy armor must have seemed anathema to Arab warriors at first, due to the sheer discomfort it must have brought on when worn, not to mention its encumbering effect. We can imagine the...
That makes a lot of sense, considering that a huge part of, it's hot there, I imagine, in the Middle East. Like, I've mentioned offhandedly it's hot here in California. It's basically a desert here. And it gets really bad, like, in the hundreds. So, I guess I'm a desert folk in that sense. You know what I mean? I joke around like that. But, like, I imagine it's even hotter in the freaking Middle East, Arabia. Like, I imagine that's heat that I couldn't even fathom. You know what I mean? And so, like, having to, like, be there, the thought of wearing heavy armor sounds insane to me, and fighting in that, and having to march in the heat just sounds insane to me. So I could see that, especially since so much of their tactics relied on just them being fast and swift. I guess the thought of armor in that sense as well was just like annoying, right? So I don't know, but I can understand them not liking that,
More well-off Arab warriors investing in a coat of mail only to speak to their comrades about it and be met with traditionalist derision at wearing such a burdensome thing. Therefore, it may have been that use of armor was based upon both a warrior's ability to obtain it, in addition to the willingness to don it in battle and on the march. Conversely, it might also have been the case that mail was reserved for frontline troops, while rear-line infantry and archers went without. Whatever the case, a notable and repeated occurrence during the Rashidun's expansion was trouble facing enemy archers. It became so bad that whilst fighting the Byzantines in the eventual victory at Yarmouk, Islamic warriors suffered what became known in legend as the Day of Lost Eyes. It might have been that this, in addition to other such occasions, was brought on by a reluctance to wear heavy armor and helmets. Two other crucial...
That would also explain, because when we covered in Season 1, whenever they started using archery against the Muslims, the Romans and Sassanids kind of were winning. So that explains why archery was so effective. I'm glad he's explaining all this, because I feel like this is explaining some questions I had in Season 1. I'm happy that we're covering it now. Though I feel like this probably should have been like the first episode of just the entire series, you know what I mean? Before Season 1, but it probably would have helped with some of my thoughts, you know? But still, better late than never, eh?
Units which partially made up Rashidun armies have come to symbolize the Muslim style of war during this period: the Mobile Guard Cavalry Strike Force and the Mubarizan. Rather than being a default part of the Islamic Army of Expansion as an institution, however, the Mobile Guard in particular was in fact a circumstantial reorganization enacted by the great General Khalid ibn al-Walid in the middle of his invasion of Syria. After the commander's triumph at Ajnadayn in late 634, it was clear that the next stage of the Muslim invasion would have to pierce deep into Syria. So, sifting through the 8,000-strong army under his leadership, Khalid extracted the most veteran, most elite, and deadliest fighters to form a 4,000-man-strong band of horsemen, which was known as the Army of Movement, or more commonly, the Mobile Guard. In an army whose warriors were already battle-hardened veterans, these paragons were the creme de la creme. One of those hand-picked 4,000 was the near-mythical warrior Kaka bin Amr. Not only did this ferocious lieutenant supposedly play a crucial role in both the Battle of Chains and the Battle of Yarmouk, but he was also personally chosen by the Caliph to lead Arab reinforcements to the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. If our sources are to be believed, he also played a key role in winning this domino-toppling clash as an energetic cavalry commander.
Yeah, I think he's the one who came up with the idea to disguise the camels as like some type of monsters to scare the horses. Like, Kekher was incredibly... he caught my attention real quick. And you can see why. The man was just a gifted fighter.
That was the sheer quality of soldiers assembled together in Khalid's elite unit. As a coherent and unified force, the Mobile Guard was frequently used by the legendary Sword of Allah as a lethal mounted reserve, which could be used whenever it was seen fit. The unit could plug a hole in allied lines by riding swiftly to where aid was most needed, or it could sweep around the flanks of an...
Yeah, I wish he had put this video first before Season 1, because I feel like this perfectly explains a lot of things. We saw this in practice. He never mentioned them being the elite guard or army of movement, but we did see Khalid often use these reserves in battle to do exactly this, so it's cool now to finally have a name to these troops, instead of just the reserves, you know, as I was calling them. But yeah, insane.
An enemy to roll up their battle line and win the battle. Under Khalid's generalship, it played both of these roles during the battle at Yarmouk. Despite its fame and flashy style of warfare, the Rashidun Mobile Guard was an incredibly short-lived entity, which nevertheless served its purpose. When Khalid was dismissed from his post by Umar, the regiment as a unified entity was simply disbanded and its members dispatched to other fronts in Islam's ongoing wars of conquest. Many more of its warriors apparently passed away during the plague of 639 to 640, and those few who survived accompanied Amr ibn Alas to Egypt. The Mubarizan, translated as duelists or champions, served
the duelists last season were insane. Anytime the Muslims got into a duel, it was an instant win. Like, again, like, it explains why they're such good fighters. And I'm glad, because I'm like, these guys are insane. Anytime a Muslim Arab duelist shows up, they instantly win.
Purpose one would expect of a warrior bearing their title. The bravest men in all the Arab armies, Mubarizan would step forward alone and battle a Byzantine or Persian champion in the ritualized single combat which was so common in that period. Arab champions were particularly deadly, gaining victory in most battles. As victors, they would bring pride to their religion and caliphate, morale to the army, and conversely demoralize the enemy force. Still, despite their successes, Muslim forces frequently found themselves on the sharp end of heavy casualty figures, and manpower replenishment rapidly became an issue that the caliphs needed to deal with. Part of this shortfall was made up by non-Arab deserters who took up with the invaders and quickly became key cogs in the overall machine of expansion out of the Arabian Peninsula. As early as the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah, 4,000 soldiers from the army of Rostam Farrukhzad went over to the Muslim side. So great was this coup that the defecting warriors were able to demand from the Arabs land of their own choosing, to closely associate themselves with an Arab band of their own preference, and to be paid salaries, sometimes in excess of regular Arab warriors.
Interesting he mentions the manpower situation with the Arabs. Like, he never brought that up before, but I'm glad he's bringing up also just the deserting, because like last in season 1, especially around against the Sassanids, he mentioned like Persian commanders giving advice to the Muslims. So I'm kind of glad to see just how much we're turning, and also I had heard that many provinces were already rebelling against the Sassanids, and just their entire empire was already kind of a mess and like not fully unified at some point. So it makes sense that so many went over to, the Muslim side.
And other such traitors to the Sassanid Shah's cause were known as the Hamra, or Red People. This phenomenon became so prevalent that during the Muslim invasion of Khuzestan and the siege of Shushtar, a famous unit of elite Persian soldiers, known thereafter as the Asawira, led by one of Yezdegerd's most senior and trusted commanders, also went over to the Caliph's side. Not only did these most capable of soldiers convert to the new and rising religion of Islam, but they were given in exchange the highest possible level of pay, dwellings in the new town of Basra, and a position of honor within the Bani Tamim tribe.
Oh.
While a massive amount...
Yeah, these guys got a pretty sweet deal, eh? Basically defected and just ended up getting more pay than the guys who were conquering. That's a pretty sweet deal, though. Like, legit, though, I might have took it.
of Byzantine territory was lost to the Arabs. It paled to the annihilation which they inflicted on the Sassanid state, almost certainly in large part due to this lack of faith in their leadership. Persian civilians and soldiers alike seemed all too eager to defect and join the invaders at the slightest opportunity, perhaps due to instability within the royal house, weakness of leadership, or oppressive taxes. Conversely, Arab soldiers were, as soldiers go, relatively well behaved. Atrocities still no doubt occurred in great quantities,
as they do in all war, right?
Majority of military conflicts.
Yeah.
However, Islamic rules about military conduct, known as siyar, mandated that some sense of civilization remained even at the darkest points of war. Enemy envoys were to be safeguarded and inviolate, non-combatant civilians were to be treated as neutral parties, and truces were to be accepted wherever possible. Do not kill women or children, or an aged infirm person, once proclaimed Caliph Abu Bakr. Do not cut down fruit-bearing trees. Do not destroy an inhabited place. Do not slaughter sheep or camels except for food. Do not burn bees and do not scatter them. Do not steal from the booty and do not be cowardly. This kind of attitude, which ideally would result in minimal damage to enemy civilian occupations and populations, is likely to have garnered the invading Arabs incredible favor.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like, they're being done with the, with the royal family and whatnot, and like these new guys showing up and just being better. Great PR overall. Great conduct.
In the previous season, we covered the first stages of the Muslim conquest of the Middle East. It started in 633 with the campaign in Mesopotamia against the Sassanid Empire, led by the general of the Rashidun Caliphate, Khalid ibn al-Walid. After a string of victories that brought him to the border of the Eastern Roman Empire, Khalid entered Syria and again won a number of decisive battles, culminating at the Battle of Yarmouk, which put most of the region under the control of the Caliphate. In southern Mesopotamia, though, the Sassanid Empire attempted a counterattack, which led to the Battle of Al-Qadisiyah. After the battle, that continued for days, the Muslim army, commanded by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, defeated Rostam's Sassanid force. Amidst the slaughter and unfolding catastrophe at Qadisiyah, the commander of the Persian centre-right, Jalinus, assumed leadership of the imperial army's remnant and set about saving what forces he could. Assembling a small elite strike force, he thrust towards the Al-Atiq Dam and drove a unit of Muslim troops away before forming a perimeter and holding it. As Sassanid stragglers withdrew across the dam wall to the other side, Jalinus bravely repelled many attacks from the Muslims and managed to see most of the remaining troops to safety, but it was still a painfully small number. When the last of them were on the canal's far side, Jalinus had the dam destroyed and began hastily pulling his men upstream to Najaf before the victors fully turned on him. Unwilling, however, to give the foe any breathing room, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas dispatched Kaka and Shirabil to hunt down scattered Persian units, while cavalry commander Zura bin al-Hawiyah was sent after Jalinus with 300 elite Arab horsemen. Not deterred by the dam crossing's destruction, Zura and his 300 drove their mounts into the torrent and forded it before chasing Jalinus's column upstream. The latter realized
That's cool. They don't even need freaking bridges. They can just cross bodies of water like that.
he was being chased, and halted with his own cavalry at a nearby bridge, while the infantry carried on withdrawing all the way to Najaf. After a short time, the horsemen of Zura came across Jalinus's valiant rearguard and charged it, breaking the formation swiftly and provoking its leader into yet another withdrawal. His heels constantly bit by Zura as he did, Jalinus chose to turn and face the enemy in a final fight, believing that the best way to stop the pursuit was to kill the leader. So, he halted his forces, turned about face, and arrayed for battle, before personally riding before his troops and challenging Zura to single combat. Galloping forward atop their horses, the two exhausted commanders fought one another to decide the issue once and for all. And once again it was the Muslim who came out on top after a hard-fought struggle. Jalinus was killed, and his
undefeated in duels, right?
cavalry took flight, but many were still caught and slain by Zura's riders. By sunset, the 300 reached Najaf, where they halted for the night. With the aim of conquering prosperous Iraq, which the Muslims believed was the heart of the world, Sa'd reorganized his 20,000 troops into 5 marching corps, with Zura retaining his advance guard position. 2 weeks after Qadisiyah, he was quickly joined at Najaf by the remainder of the army and given the order to cross the Euphrates. Incoming Sassanid reinforcements under Nakirjan arrived in the area soon after, having been initially bound for Rostam's now broken force. Hearing of the defeat, the reinforcement group halted east of the Euphrates and waited for new orders from Ctesiphon, which came in the form of Firzan, a general tasked by Emperor Yazdegerd with preventing or delaying the seemingly unstoppable advance of the Muslims. When Firzan appraised the situation, he decided that his army of fresh and recently defeated forces under his command wouldn't be enough to throw the Arabs back. So he instead prepared defensive actions at a series of defensible locations and cities on the road to the Persian capital, so that the great city would have time to fortify. As his first move, Firzan ordered the governor of Burz, Busbura, to hold his branch of the Euphrates and gave him some troops to help with the task, while the general and his main army started massing near Babylon. When Zura's advance guard neared Burz, the city's governor rode out to meet him. In a short battle, the holding force of Sassanid troops was routed and Busbura severely wounded. During the flight, he died from his wounds. Following this defeat, the new local leader made peace with the Caliphate, agreeing to provide information and logistical assistance. From these new allies, Zura learned that the formidable main Sassanid army opposing him was indeed across the Euphrates at Babylon, along with several high nobles. Zura then forwarded this crucial information to Sa'd at Najaf and waited for the 4 corps trailing his own to catch up. When they did, the Muslims advanced on Babylon in strength, and at some point in December 636, met Firzan along the riverbank and crushed his army in a brief but harsh battle. One of the defeated generals, Hormuzan, fled south with his contingent to his domain in Awaz, while Firzan and the remainder withdrew north in good order, leaving garrisons at Sura and Dirkab along the way. Zura again set off in hot pursuit, and, despite fierce resistance from the defensive Sassanid armies in his way, managed to defeat them at Sura, Dirkab and Kusa on his relentless drive to Ctesiphon. By early January of 637, the Muslim leader neared Vologesakerta, just one of the cities which made up larger Ctesiphon, where he was again rejoined by the bulk of his army. To the desert-dwelling Arabs, whose largest urban center.
It's now cool to see that they're threatening Ctesiphon itself, because last season, Khalid, at least early on, didn't, mainly due to logistics and supply issues, but now they're here. Now it's like, this is like taking, yeah, it's their capital, right? So, already just insane.
Centers were but a fraction of the size. The Persian capital was unlike anything most of them had ever witnessed in their lives. More than just a single city, Ctesiphon had in fact grown to encompass about 7 grandiose population centers which had been constructed and assimilated over the centuries, forming a true metropolis. Because of its unique nature, the Persian heartland was dubbed Madain, or the cities in Arabic. On the Tigris's western bank.
That sounds incredibly cool. You know, sometimes I kind of wish I could go back in time and just see certain civilizations, like, and their beauty. Like, cities like this, like Rome at its peak, or, you know, like this, Ctesiphon. Like, there just seems like it would be so beautiful just to witness with, like, my own eyes, you know? I don't know, something I really wish, but that sounded, like, really cool, though. Just like this hog melting pot of cities, if you were.
Stood Seleucia, Vologesakerta, and Ve'ardashir, while Ctesiphon proper and a number of peripheral hubs were to the east. Perhaps the most majestic sight for those approaching Arabs during 637 would have been the 40-meter tall Arch of Khosrow, an architectural marvel unique in the world at the time. Although Firzan hadn't managed to stop the Muslim advance, his delaying action had worked, and now the entire western portion of Yezdegerd's imperial capital was fortified with a deep ditch with manned positions at regular intervals. The Sassanid Shah and his advisors also massed a number of ballistae and catapults in the bounds of Ve'ardashir, which, as the closest sub-city to Ctesiphon proper, was the focus of their defensive efforts.
I'll say though, like you would think like Ctesiphon would be like the biggest siege challenge that the Muslims would have, because last season 1 the Muslims didn't really have much access to like siege equipment, like, you know, like rams or towers or catapults, etc. And mainly they just relied on starving out entire populations and just surrounding it, just kind of waiting out sieges or fighting some other way in. And that has worked beautifully for them, but you think Ctesiphon would be well provisioned, right? Like, it is the capital after all, and well defended. So like, I'm wondering how the Muslims can do it if they still don't have like siege equipment, or they're gonna have to step up their siege game in order to take what I'd imagine would the Persians would give a great fight to, keep their capital, essentially, right?
Zura ordered an attack on Madain shortly after his arrival, but Yazdegerd's artillery began launching bolts and throwing giant stones out of Ver Ardashir and into the Muslim ranks, causing severe losses and forcing Zura's forces to retreat out of range. Unable to reply in kind, he sent scouting parties to probe and find a way inside, but everywhere they came across the Persians' defensive trench and were unable to breach it. Sa'd arrived at this point and assumed command, swiftly deciding that there was little point wasting his warriors in careless assaults against such strong defenses. So instead he established a blockade around all of Madain west of the Tigris and settled his forces down for a long siege.
Okay, so he's just going with the waiting them out, the usual, right?
However, Sa'd wasn't content to sit and wait for victory, taking all measures he thought possible to secure a faster surrender of the unbelievers, primarily by scything away at the Western Bastion's food supplies. To do this, he had his sub-commanders conduct raids on the neighbouring hinterland, seizing cattle and sheep for the Muslims' own use, whilst also sapping the enemy's resources by preventing supplies from reaching Ver Ardashir. In the process of doing so, Arab cavalry seized thousands of farmers as prisoners of war, who, upon the intercession of a regional leader who had submitted, were freed upon agreeing to pay the jizya tax. In addition, security for their lives and possessions were guaranteed, an act which won the Muslim invaders considerable goodwill with the locals. Throughout the month-long siege, Sa'd's warriors had also been continuously harried by the sophisticated Sassanid engines of war Yazdegerd's generals had amassed, although casualties...
Yeah, it's also kind of cool to see just the equipment such as catapults and whatnot, and how the Muslims can overcome that challenge as well.
...as their hands remained relatively light. Unfortunately for the Persians, some of their engineers defected during the course of the siege and provided their masters with at least 20 novel artillery pieces of their own.
Holy crap, now they have frickin' artillery. Insane. Insane, guys. Now, that's if they weren't dangerous enough, now they got friggin' siege equipment just like that. I was wondering, but again, like, so far the defecting Persians have been so useful for the Muslims, right? Like between helping them win battles and whatnot, they've been really useful. And it's kind of cool that the Muslims have kind of just adopted the Persians into their ranks, just like taking their advice, taking their aid. Like, it's not like, oh, you're not completely one of us. It's like, no, you're allowed. Like, you're cool. We're cool. You know what I mean? So I don't know. I think it's really cool. I think that's a good aspect of them, willing to adopt and just kind of assimilate conquered people essentially in their aid, right?
When these contraptions subsequently began sending their own missiles howling into Ctesiphon, the dense concentration of Sassanid soldiers and civilians inside resulted in them causing terrible destruction. The fact that the Muslims had even acquired weaponry of this kind, which had until then been universally in Persian hands, also badly affected morale. By mid-March 637, Western Madain's situation was becoming intolerable. Persian civilians starved to death in the hundreds, while more and more were reduced to eating stray cats and dogs to survive.
Ugh.
Beset by such conditions, the Sassanid troops not manning the ditch were concentrated into a single strike force and led in a desperate sortie beyond their defences. The Muslims arrayed to meet them in a pitched battle, and a desperate struggle began. Zura's corps was in the thick of the action, and he himself was wounded by an arrow. Despite his injury, the valiant Bani Tamin chief led a counterattack and personally slew the Persian strike force commander, after which the defenders withdrew behind their ditch. The savage fighting to repulse the Persian attack was followed by a few hours of eerie calm, during which a Sassanid officer approached the Muslims with an offer. Each belligerent would retain whatever territory they had captured on their respective sides of the Tigris. However, these conditions were declined with the reply, "There can never be peace between us until we get the honey out of the lemons of Kusa." When these peace overtures were rejected, the Persian forces...
Yeah, there's only really three options when you negotiate with the Muslims, right? Either convert, pay the tax, or death. Like, there's really nothing else you can do, right? Like, those are the only terms you can agree to with them.
in Ver-Ardashir quietly withdrew from their positions and pulled back across the Tigris. Western Ctesiphon was now under Muslim control.
Insane, they already have a foothold in the city.
Gerd III also sent his family, retainers and treasury ahead to Hulwan, where the emperor intended to move his court if the great capital fell. Although behaving as if defeat was already inevitable, from his seat in the White Palace, Yazdegerd appointed Rostam's brother, Kurazad, and Miran to command the defense of the eastern city. These generals promptly redeployed their remaining forces on the eastern bank and waited for the besiegers' next move. That same evening, on the river's edge of newly occupied Ver-Ardashir, Saad stared across the Tigris at the glorious Arch of Khosrow and pondered his next move, eager to claim it for Islam. As Muhammad's former companion strategized to himself, a Persian approached him and asked, "What are you waiting for?" Followed by the alarming revelation that not another 2 days will pass before Yazdegerd departs the capital with everything in Ctesiphon. Time was now of the essence. Another sympathetic local, possibly disillusioned by heavy Sassanid taxation, or possibly even a recent convert to Islam, took Saad to a known ford in the river, one which Saad deemed unsuitable due to the swift current and deep water. Rather than making a hasty decision right then, he chose to sleep on the issue and decide in the morning. During the night, Saad supposedly had a strange dream in which he saw the Tigris's waters, only they were flowing incredibly quickly and were unrealistically deep. Still, his own Arab cavalry appeared and plunged into the seemingly impassable torrent, reaching the other side relatively easily. The next morning, Saad convened a conference of his highest generals and declared that the cavalry would swim through the river, and
they're just gonna go for it. Like, forget the bridges, we're just gonna swim through it. Like, I think that's pretty like telling of the Arabs, right? Like, if there's no way, you just make one. I wonder if they're actually gonna have any issues with a river crossing.
And asked if there were any volunteers to lead the dangerous attack. The first to put himself forward was Asim bin Amr, Kaka's tribal comrade and a dashing military leader, followed by 700 of the most reckless and brave Muslim warriors. After all necessary preparations had been made by mid-morning, Asim plunged into the water and began his crossing. Kurazad responded by ordering his Persians into the river to meet them, but after a hearty resistance, the Sassanid cavalry who responded were pushed back when one of their comrades from the city came, shouting, "Why are you killing yourselves? There's nobody left in Ctesiphon to defend." He was at least partially correct. Upon receiving word that the Muslims were crossing the Tigris, Emperor Yazdegerd had departed his capital for Hulwan, taking much of the imperial court with him. After their resistance faltered.
Holy crap, he just left Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon's basically screwed now, right?
Most of the army defending the city followed suit.
And amazing though, that river crossing, they just went for it and they just succeeded, man.
Save for a Sassanid regiment fortified in the White Palace. On the Tigris, Saad took the opportunity Asim's lance-like advance had given him and began ferrying the rest of his warriors across to the beachhead, not without danger of succumbing to the raging waters. One man fell from his horse and fell into the current, but the all-powerful Kaka reached down in the nick of time and heaved him up. Despite the myriad dangers of the crossing, in relatively short order, the entire Islamic army was on the eastern bank of the Tigris River. The moment Saad himself landed, he ordered Asim and Kaka to move on the core of Ctesiphon. in the process of which they encountered token resistance, but this was quickly dealt with. The Muslims found their final opposition in the White Palace, but chose to deal with it by sending forward yet another companion of Muhammad, Salman. A Persian by birth, he had converted to Islam after meeting the Prophet in Arabia, and now his heritage proved a crucial boon. "I am actually one of you, I feel for you," he said upon meeting the defenders, and outlined the usual three choices: jizya, conversion, or death. After a short negotiation, the hopeless palace troops accepted the Islamic tax and surrendered. Ctesiphon, jewel of the Sassanid imperial superpower for over 4 centuries, was now in Arab hands, a people who had—
Wow. Like, just the power of that sentence. So many centuries of this being, under the Persian rule, now just done like that.
been a mere afterthought only years earlier. Separate columns of Arab riders under Zura and Kaka galloped forth from the captured city almost immediately, moving in different directions in pursuit of their enemy. The spoils were plenty. For example, 11 priceless suits of armor and swords which belonged to Heraclius of the Byzantine Empire, the Turkish Kagan, and other world leaders. Other treasures now in Saad's hands included gold, jewels, and imperial regalia. With the Sassanid capital had come the empire's boundless wealth, and also the first major mass conversions of Persians to Islam. Salman the Persian in particular played a role in this religious change, preaching to his countrymen the values and beliefs of the new faith. Although Ctesiphon and all the Sawad was lost to the House of Sassan, the Persians' resistance to their conquest by the Muslims would continue in the old heartland beyond the Zagros.
Well, in the video right here, this is a great first part. I'll see you guys tomorrow in part 2.